The storm raged as the ancient castle trembled under the force of the wind. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating broken stone walls where secrets had long been buried. A sudden crash echoed through the halls as a hidden door swung open, revealing a chamber untouched by time. Within, a blade pulsed with a dark glow, humming with whispers of forgotten power. The narrator spoke of destiny as Edward said, "What force dares awaken now?" His voice trembled as he stepped closer, heart hammering with fear and curiosity. The cursed sword shimmered as if calling him, and a chill seeped into his bones. Outside, a bell tolled, its sound heavy with doom, echoing across the valley. Edward said, "I feel its gaze on me." He reached out, fingers brushing the hilt, and shadows surged like smoke around his arm. The whispers grew louder, urging him to claim it. From the darkness, a hidden voice whispered a truth that pierced his heart, binding him to a fate he never sought. The storm outside roared louder as Edward staggered backward, his breath ragged and chest tight from the sword's surge. He clutched the hilt tighter, though fear consumed him. Edward said, "It will not release me." The chamber trembled, runes flashing angrily along the blade. The whispers swelled, promising glory but demanding sacrifice. Edward collapsed to one knee, feeling unseen eyes watching. A torch toppled, fire flickering dangerously across the stone floor. Edward said, "What curse binds this steel?" Shadows swirled like serpents, and the bell's toll reverberated again, as if marking his doom. The storm gave way to silence, but inside Edward heard the cursed whispers more clearly than ever. They spoke of thrones lost, blood spilled, and kingdoms brought to ruin. Edward said, "No, this is not my fate." His voice cracked, though his grip betrayed his desperation. The sword pulsed, binding itself to his flesh, burning strange sigils into his wrist. He gasped in agony, the pain unlike anything mortal. The chamber shook violently, dust raining down from above. Edward said, "I will not be your pawn." Yet the blade laughed within his mind, mocking his resistance. Outside, lightning carved the sky, yet within the ruined castle, Edward's cries drowned all sound. The cursed sword fed on his fear, wrapping him in coils of shadow. Edward said, "I feel it devouring me." His body shook, sweat dripping from his brow, his tunic torn by invisible claws. A vision burst before him, cities aflame, rivers red with blood, and the throne room in ruins. Edward shouted, "This cannot be truth." He clutched his chest as the blade's whispers sank deeper. A final toll from the bell thundered as though sealing his fate. The visions faded, leaving Edward slumped against the pedestal, exhausted but bound forever to the cursed blade. His eyes burned with both terror and unwilling resolve. Edward whispered, "If I must carry this, I will bend it to my will." The blade pulsed in acknowledgement, as if mocking his claim. The storm outside began to settle, but the damage was done. Destiny had taken root. Edward rose slowly, the weight of doom pressing on his shoulders. He gazed at the fallen hall and whispered, "So it begins." The castle ruins faded behind Edward as dawn broke over the valley, pale light brushing across the soaked earth. He stumbled into the forest, clutching the cursed blade wrapped in cloth, though its whispers echoed in his mind. Edward said, "You will not command me." Yet his steps faltered, his body trembling from the night's torment. Birds stirred in the branches above, unsettled by his presence. A rustling sound drew his gaze as Gregory, the loyal companion, approached with wary eyes. Gregory said, "Edward, what madness has found you?" Edward's breath caught, shame and fear warring within. The cursed sword pulsed faintly, and shadows coiled around his arm before vanishing. Edward said, "It found me, and I cannot let it go." Gregory placed a firm hand on his shoulder, determination shining. Gregory said, "Then you will not bear this alone." The forest groaned with the wind as fate began binding them together. Hours passed as Edward and Gregory traveled deeper into the forest, their silence heavy, broken only by whispers of the sword. Edward said, "It shows me ruins and death like warnings." Gregory's face hardened, his voice sharp with concern. Gregory said, "It is poison in your mind, Edward." A branch snapped ahead, and they froze, eyes narrowing as a cloaked figure emerged from the mist. It was Eleanor, the forbidden ally, her hood pulled low, but her presence commanding. Eleanor said, "So the blade has chosen." Edward's chest tightened, sensing recognition in her tone. Gregory stepped forward defensively. Gregory said, "State your purpose." Eleanor's gaze shifted from one to the other, a spark of sorrow flickering. Eleanor said, "I am bound to help him, though it will destroy us both." The forest seemed to darken, as if listening. Eleanor lowered her hood, revealing striking eyes that seemed both fierce and mournful. Edward said, "You know this blade." She nodded solemnly, her lips trembling with restraint. Eleanor said, "It is cursed with blood, forged in betrayal. Touch it too long, and it consumes you." Gregory bristled, his voice filled with anger. Gregory said, "Then why not destroy it?" Eleanor's eyes turned away, her tone heavy with regret. Eleanor said, "Because its power is bound to the throne, and without it, the kingdom will fall to the Dark King." Edward clenched his jaw, torn by dread and duty. Edward said, "Then I am doomed either way." The cursed sword pulsed faintly beneath the cloth, its glow staining the mist with red. The forest grew darker as clouds blotted out the morning sun. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Eleanor said, "Edward, you must learn control before the blade claims you." Gregory's hand tightened on his sword hilt, distrust flaring. Gregory said, "Why should we trust her?" Edward felt the curse pulse, heat radiating into his chest. He said, "Because she knows what I do not." Eleanor's eyes glistened with pain, her words striking like daggers. Eleanor said, "My bloodline is tied to this curse. To help you is to seal my own fate." Gregory's shoulders sagged, conflicted, while Edward looked between them, the weight of choice pressing hard. The wind shifted, carrying the faint toll of a distant bell. Edward shivered, recalling the night before. Eleanor said, "The curse awakens with each toll. You have little time." Gregory scowled, his voice full of doubt. Gregory said, "Every word of hers reeks of danger." Edward lowered his gaze, voice trembling but steady. Edward said, "Then danger is already ours to bear." The cursed blade pulsed faintly beneath the cloth, and shadows flickered across the forest floor. Eleanor touched the blade briefly, wincing as if burned, then drew back. Eleanor said, "Its hunger grows. You must decide whether to master it or let it consume you." Edward's breath shook as he whispered, "Then we walk toward doom together." The forest path twisted into jagged cliffs where the mist thickened into a shroud. Edward staggered, each step heavier as the cursed sword burned against his chest. Gregory kept close, his hand never straying far from his own blade. Gregory said, "You grow paler with every mile." Edward forced a weary smile, though his eyes betrayed his torment. Edward said, "The sword gnaws at me, whispering of blood." Eleanor walked ahead, her cloak trailing through damp soil. Eleanor said, "Then you must face its trials now before it consumes you." A flicker of firelight danced in the fog, revealing a carved stone archway. Shadows writhed on its surface, alive and watching. Edward hesitated, dread chilling his breath. Edward said, "This is where it begins." The cursed whispers surged, louder than ever, as the ancient trials stirred awake. The stone archway groaned as the trio stepped closer, its runes pulsing crimson in rhythm with Edward's heartbeat. Gregory muttered curses under his breath, unease etched in his stance. Gregory said, "This reeks of death." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her tone sharp but steady. Eleanor said, "It is a trial of will. If Edward cannot endure, we all fall." Edward's hand shook as he reached for the runes, their heat scalding his skin. Edward said, "Then fate grants me no mercy." The air cracked with a surge of power, pulling them inside a cavern of endless flame and shadow. The whispers grew into screams, clawing at Edward's mind. Eleanor grabbed his arm, grounding him with her gaze. Eleanor said, "Do not listen. The fire only devours the weak." Edward clenched his jaw, refusing to falter. The chamber shifted, illusions rising from the fire. Edward gasped as visions formed around him. His family slain, his people crying out in despair. Edward said, "No, this cannot be real." The cursed whispers laughed, echoing in every flame. Gregory lunged forward, slicing at the fire's illusions, though his blade cut only smoke. Gregory said, "Fight it, Edward." Eleanor's voice broke through, calm yet urgent. Eleanor said, "See the lies for what they are. They are shadows, not truth." Edward fell to his knees, clutching his skull as screams battered his mind. He forced his voice out through clenched teeth. Edward said, "You will not have me." The flames roared higher, forming monstrous shapes, testing his resolve with every breath. The firestorm coalesced into a monstrous figure of smoke and ash, towering above them, its voice thunderous. Shadows said, "Submit, Edward, and be reborn in power." Edward staggered to his feet, sweat and soot streaking his face. Edward said, "I will not yield to shadows." The figure lashed out, sending waves of heat and force that threw Gregory and Eleanor to the ground. Gregory cried out, voice strained. "Gregory," said Edward, "end this madness." Eleanor rose with defiance, shouting through the chaos. Eleanor said, "The blade feeds on your fear, deny it." Edward gripped the cursed sword with both hands, the crimson glow burning brighter as he raised it against the shadow. Edward said, "Then burn with me, but never own me." With a scream, Edward drove the cursed sword into the heart of the fiery shadow, and the cavern erupted in light. The figure shattered into embers, its roar fading into silence. Edward collapsed forward, chest heaving, his knuckles white on the hilt. Gregory staggered to his side, pulling him upright with effort. Gregory said, "You did not falter." Edward coughed, his voice ragged but resolute. Edward said, "It will never stop testing me." Eleanor approached, her gaze filled with sorrow. Eleanor said, "Then this was only the beginning." The cavern walls cracked, stone falling as the trial dissolved. Light engulfed them, and the trio was cast back into the misty forest, forever changed by what they had endured. The mist parted to reveal a ruined watchtower, overlooking the valley. Edward staggered forward, his strength waning as the cursed sword pulsed violently. Edward said, "It grows heavier with each breath." Gregory steadied him, concern flashing across his face. Gregory said, "You cannot carry this weight alone." Eleanor walked behind, her voice sharp but heavy with sorrow. Eleanor said, "The sword feeds on doubt, Edward, and it will strike when you are weakest." Edward's lips pressed into a thin line as he pushed open the tower's broken door. Inside, a faint fire glowed, and a cloaked figure emerged from the shadows. Marcus, the deceptive ally, smiled warmly, though his eyes flickered with hidden intent. Marcus said at last, "We meet where fate intended." Inside the ruined watchtower, the air smelled of damp ash and betrayal. Marcus spread his arms as if welcoming friends. Marcus said, "You carry what kings once feared to wield." Edward tightened his grip, suspicion in his gaze. Edward said, "And you waited for me to fall." Gregory stepped forward, anger sharpening his tone. Gregory said, "Speak plain, Marcus, or leave us." Marcus smirked, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Marcus said, "I only seek to guide Edward, for his path is perilous." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, sensing the trap beneath his words. Eleanor said, "Every serpent coils with charm before it strikes." Edward's pulse quickened as the cursed whispers urged him to listen. The fire cracked as Marcus circled the group like a predator in disguise. Marcus said, "Edward, the kingdom rots, and only the blade can cleanse it." Edward's voice shook with restrained anger. Edward said, "The blade consumes. It does not save." Gregory moved closer, hand clenched, his mistrust plain. Gregory said, "You crave power, not salvation." Eleanor's eyes locked on Marcus, her tone a whisper edged with warning. Eleanor said, "Beware him, Edward, for his truth is poison." Marcus's smile faltered briefly, his mask slipping, revealing hunger in his eyes. Marcus said, "Better poison than weakness." Cursed sword flared red as if responding to his words. The air grew thick, and Marcus's tone hardened. Marcus said, "You cannot escape destiny. Join me, Edward, and together we will forge a kingdom of fire and iron." Edward's jaw tightened, fury and doubt warring inside. Edward said, "I will not be your pawn." Gregory drew his blade, stance sharp. Gregory said, "Enough of this venom." Eleanor stepped closer to Edward, her voice urgent. Eleanor said, "The choice is yours, Edward. Trust in us or in him." The cursed whispers screamed, urging Edward toward Marcus, feeding on the moment. Marcus's smile sharpened like a blade as the tower's fire dimmed to embers. The cursed sword surged, its light blazing as if feeding on the clash of wills. Edward stumbled, nearly consumed, but Gregory grabbed his shoulder, grounding him. Gregory said, "You are stronger than this." Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos, steady and fierce. Eleanor said, "Choose the path of truth, not chains." Marcus snarled, his charm unraveling. Marcus said, "Without me, you will fall to the darkness." Edward roared, lifting the sword high, its glow filling the tower. Edward said, "Then let the darkness face me, not bind me." The chamber shook violently, dust falling from the ceiling as the cursed power erupted, throwing Marcus back into the shadows. The forest's silence broke as Edward collapsed against a fallen tree, his chest heaving, the cursed sword glowing faintly in his grip. Gregory knelt beside him, eyes filled with worry. Gregory said, "You cannot fight forever like this." Edward's gaze drifted, shadows flickering across his eyes as if hiding a truth. Edward said, "The sword shows me visions, ones I cannot escape." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling. Eleanor said, "What visions, Edward?" His hands shook as the blade pulsed. Edward said, "It showed me betrayal from the ones I trust most." Gregory recoiled, disbelief clouding his face. Gregory said, "You do not mean us." Edward turned away, his silence heavier than words. The cursed whispers laughed in his mind, feeding on suspicion. Edward's voice cracked as he spoke again. Edward said, "It showed me Gregory striking me down, Eleanor walking away as kingdoms burned." Gregory's face twisted with pain, his voice sharp. Gregory said, "Those are lies meant to break us." Eleanor clenched her fists, her eyes wet with anger. Eleanor said, "The blade twists truth into daggers, Edward." Edward pressed the hilt to his chest, his voice low. Edward said, "But it feels so real." A crow screeched from the branches above, shattering the tense silence. Gregory moved closer, his hand gripping Edward's shoulder firmly. Gregory said, "Then trust your heart, not its poison." The cursed glow dimmed faintly, though unease lingered heavy in the air. The ground trembled as a deep rumble echoed through the forest, and Edward gasped as another vision tore through his mind. He saw the throne room collapsing in flames, a familiar figure raising the cursed sword high. Edward whispered, "It was Marcus." Gregory's jaw tightened as realization spread. Gregory said, "He wants the blade, not to guide you, but to rule." Eleanor stepped forward, urgency burning in her eyes. Eleanor said, "Then your visions show not only lies but truths buried in shadow." Edward gripped the sword tighter, torn between doubt and rage. Edward said, "If Marcus takes it, all will fall." The cursed glow surged, as if acknowledging the name. The cursed whispers rose like a storm, pressing into Edward's mind, showing Marcus crowned in fire, Eleanor chained, Gregory lifeless at his feet. Edward cried out, falling to his knees. Edward said, "It wants me to see only ruin." Gregory grasped his arm firmly, voice filled with resolve. Gregory said, "Then, see us standing beside you, not falling." Eleanor knelt across from him, her voice steady. Eleanor said, "We are here, Edward. We will not betray you." Tears burned in Edward's eyes as the blade's glow pulsed violently. Edward said, "Then I must face the truth of what it shows me." The forest wind howled as the cursed visions reached their peak. The cursed visions shattered into shards of light, leaving Edward trembling but alive. The forest fell silent, the glow of the blade fading to a faint pulse. Edward's breath came heavy as he looked to his companions. Edward said, "The blade reveals not just lies, but the path ahead." Gregory's voice softened, steady and loyal. Gregory said, "Then we walk it together, no matter the cost." Eleanor placed her hand over Edward's, her eyes glistening with resolve. Eleanor said, "And we will face the truth, even if it breaks us." Edward rose shakily, lifting the sword with renewed strength. Edward said, "Then the curse will not define me. I will." The wind hushed, and the forest seemed to bow to the choice made. The sky burned red as Edward, Gregory, and Eleanor approached the ruined citadel where the final battle waited. The cursed sword pulsed violently, its whispers now screams. Edward said, "The blade knows its master is near." Gregory's hand tightened around his own sword, his voice steady but grim. Gregory said, "Then let us meet him as one." Eleanor's cloak whipped in the wind, her tone unwavering. Eleanor said, "The Dark King will not yield easily." A shadow rose over the shattered gates, Marcus stepping forward with cruel triumph in his eyes. Marcus said, "Edward, you bring me the gift I have sought. Surrender the blade, and I will spare what remains of your kingdom." Edward's jaw tightened, his voice sharp. Edward said, "You will have nothing but my defiance." The wind howled as the final confrontation began. Marcus raised his arms, and the ground trembled, dark fire bursting through the ruins as soldiers of shadow rose from the earth. Edward gritted his teeth, sweat beading across his brow. Edward said, "The curse awakens his army." Gregory slashed at the first of the shadows, voice filled with battle fury. Gregory said, "Then we cut them down." Eleanor drew her dagger, her eyes flashing like fire. Eleanor said, "Stay close, Edward. You are the key." Marcus laughed, his voice echoing like thunder. Marcus said, "Every swing of that blade binds you further, Edward." Edward's voice rang out, defiant. Edward said, "Then let it bind me only to victory." The clash of steel and shadow filled the air. The battle raged, steel clashing with shadows, screams echoing through the night. Edward struck down one foe after another, the cursed sword searing with crimson light. Edward said, "I will not fall to you, Marcus." Marcus stepped forward, blade of black steel in his grip, eyes burning with hunger. Marcus said, "You already belong to me." Gregory intercepted a strike aimed for Edward, sparks flying as their blades clashed. Gregory shouted, "Stay focused, Edward." Eleanor leapt at a shadow soldier, her dagger plunging deep as she cried. Eleanor said, "The curse will not claim him while I draw breath." Edward locked eyes with Marcus, fury and dread colliding as their destinies entwined. The ground split open, flames erupting as Marcus unleashed a torrent of dark magic. Edward staggered, shielding his face from the searing heat. Marcus said, "You cannot win. The blade was forged for me alone." Edward lifted the cursed sword, its glow burning brighter against the darkness. Edward said, "Then it chose the wrong master." Gregory shielded Edward, his voice straining with effort. Gregory said, "Strike now, Edward." Eleanor threw her dagger, forcing Marcus to falter. Eleanor said, "Do not give him breath to rise." Edward surged forward, every muscle burning, the cursed whispers screaming as he raised the sword high. The world trembled as steel met shadow. The clash echoed like thunder as Edward's cursed blade struck Marcus's dark steel. Light and shadow collided, ripping the sky apart. Edward cried out, forcing strength through agony. Edward said, "This ends now." Marcus snarled, his voice breaking with rage. Marcus said, "You are mine, Edward." Gregory and Eleanor rushed to Edward's side, bracing him with unyielding loyalty. Gregory shouted, "Stand with us!" Eleanor's voice carried through the chaos. "Eleanor said you are stronger than the curse." Edward's scream tore the night as he drove the sword deeper, crimson light engulfing Marcus. The citadel walls crumbled as Marcus fell to his knees, his reign of darkness breaking at last. The battlefield smoldered in silence, ash drifting like snow as the citadel crumbled into ruin. Edward stood trembling, cursed sword heavy in his grasp, its glow fading to a dull ember. Gregory approached slowly, placing a steadying hand on Edward's shoulder. Gregory said, "It is over." But at what cost? Eleanor stepped from the smoke, her face streaked with ash and tears, her eyes fixed on Edward. Eleanor said, "The curse still binds you." Edward lowered his gaze, his voice hoarse. Edward said, "Marcus is gone, but the blade remains a chain I cannot sever." The wind carried the echoes of screams past, as if the curse lingered in the broken stones. Edward's heart ached, knowing his victory brought no freedom. The three survivors gathered at the shattered steps of the citadel, their bodies worn but their spirits bound by trial. Edward said, "Every vision was a warning, yet the truth came all the same." Gregory shook his head, anger flashing briefly. Gregory said, "Do not blame yourself, Edward. Marcus chose his path." Eleanor knelt, brushing her hand against the cracked earth, her tone heavy with grief. Eleanor said, "But the kingdom lies broken. Victory means little when ruin remains." Edward stared at the cursed sword, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Edward said, "Perhaps ruin is all I was meant to bring." Silence fell, heavy and unyielding, as the weight of their journey pressed upon them. Edward rose unsteadily, lifting the cursed sword toward the horizon where the first rays of sunlight touched the valley. Edward said, "If I cannot destroy it, I must carry it where none can follow." Gregory's voice cracked with protest. Gregory said, "You will not bear this alone." Eleanor stepped closer, her hand brushing Edward's arm, her voice soft but resolute. Eleanor said, "If this is your fate, then let us decide it together." Edward's grip tightened, his gaze firm. Edward said, "The curse is mine to master, not yours to suffer." The light shimmered on the blade, crimson fading to silver for the briefest moment, as if testing his resolve. The wind whispered through the ruined valley, carrying both peace and foreboding. Edward lowered the blade, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. Edward said, "The curse may never end, but I can choose how it is carried." Gregory's eyes shone with unshed tears. Gregory said, "Then choose not despair, but strength." Eleanor's voice trembled with both love and fear. Eleanor said, "And promise us you will not walk into darkness alone." Edward looked at them both, heart aching with gratitude and grief. Edward said, "Then walk beside me until the path no longer allows it." Their bond, forged in blood and trial, shone brighter than the cursed steel. The sun rose higher, light scattering across broken stone and fading shadows. Edward turned toward the horizon, his back to the ruins, the cursed sword still in his grip. Edward said, "A kingdom can rise again, but my soul will carry the burden." Gregory stood firm beside him, his voice unwavering. Gregory said, "Then we will build from the ashes." Eleanor's voice followed, quiet but fierce. Eleanor said, "And we will not let the curse claim you, not while we live." Edward paused, his eyes closing for a moment, as the whispers fell silent. Edward said, "So it begins anew." The three walked into the light, their silhouettes framed by a dawn that carried both hope and haunting.